Welcome to another episode of Black History Every Day. I'm Knowledge of Self-Determination. Now, quickly, what we're going to do starting with this episode here is, first and foremost, I know it seems as though a lot of these videos have been done out of sequence, and some of them have due to a lack of information on the individual on various days. But we will try to keep the continuity as consistent and concise as possible. So, with me getting back into the swing of things with Black History Every Day, I will be starting from January the 1st. And whatever information on the days that I did not cover before is available, then I will do a video on that information. Also, additionally, at the beginning of every month, there is a headlining article about a person's event or place that is usually like I said, headline before each month or at the beginning of each month. So that is another new thing that we're going to be doing. So today, headlining the month of January is Angelina Weld Grimke, 1880-1958. Angelina Weld Grimke, playwright, poet, and short story writer, was born into a wealthy family of slave owners and abolitionists. Her father, Archibald Henry Grimke, was the son of a slave owner and his black mistress, and the nephew of celebrated abolitionists Angelina and Sarah Grimke. Archibald attended Harvard Law School with the help of his aunts, and in 1874 became the second black to graduate from the school. In 1878, he married Sarah Stanley, the daughter of a white minister, and the following year, their only child was born. Grimke was named for her great aunt, Angelina, and her uncle Theodore Weld, also a staunch abolitionist. At age 7, Grimke was abandoned by her mother, an event that affected her deeply. She found emotional release through her writing, which often expressed despair and rejection. In 1902, she moved to the Washington, D.C. area, where she taught at Armstrong Training School and Dunbar High School. At Dunbar, she wrote Rachel, the first play to be written and staged by an African-American woman, and one of the first to be written with staging in mind. The play depicting the effects of racism and racial prejudice in America made a strong political statement and was a milestone in black theater. Grimke was an active participant in the Harlem Renaissance. W.E.B. Du Bois' Craigwell Players staged her plays, and she was a friend to such writers as Jessie Redmond Fawcett, Georgia Douglas Johnson, Countee Cullen, and William Stanley Braithwaite. What's up, guys? Welcome to another episode of Black History Every Day. Now, what I want to first do is explain why it may appear as though the audio is not in sync with the video. Now, when I initially did this, I recorded the video and I talked through the actual play-by-play as I was going live with the video and going through the info. But what I'm doing here, because the audio didn't actually record, is re-recording the audio and trying to convey the basic premise of the video based on the information that's on the screen. And we're talking about the 1808 quote-unquote slavery abolition. And that's what pops up in Google. These are the things that pop up in Google when you actually search for the 1808 slave abolition. You know, and in actuality, and this is another thing too. See, America and American history likes to tell us that America abolished slavery. And right here in this video, I am recanting and conceding that I was wrong when I said that Great Britain was the first country or nation to abolish slavery. Great Britain, just like America, did not abolish slavery. America just followed suit what Great Britain did. And what they did was abolish the slave trade, the importing of slaves, I should say. That is important. The language that we use is very important. As we read, the Act Prohibiting Importation of Slaves, March 2nd, 1807, is a United States federal law that stated that no new slaves were permitted to be imported into the United States. It took effect in 1808, the earliest date permitted by the U.S. Constitution. The legislation was promoted by President Thomas Jefferson, who called for its enactment in his 1806 State of the Union address. Now remember, as being highlighted, no new slaves were permitted to be imported. That does not say that the act of enslaving people is abolished and now illegal. All it says is no new slaves are to be imported. It says nothing about people who are already enslaved in those particular countries. It says nothing about trading slaves in that country and between the states and cities within that country. It just says you cannot import any more slaves. The act of importing slaves is illegal. Okay? We have to get that. We have to get the language correct. Because if we do not get the language correct, we will constantly be misleaded. Now, the founding fathers are always a double-edged sword, because you'll see white America, because white America, they don't really fall back on black historians telling the real true version of history. They fall back on what their historians say. And white people hold Thomas Jefferson up on a pedestal because he was an advocate fighting for the abolishment of slavery. But he wasn't. So that he was a slave owner. And not just a slave owner, but like most of the quote-unquote colonists, colonizers, enslavers, because I'm not calling them masters. That's out of the question. But just like most of them, they also participated in molesting and raping their slaves. Yeah, Sally Hemings was being molested by Thomas Jefferson for the entirety of her life. And his family that exists now in contemporary times does not look at the children that they had together as being part of their family. So let's move on. Now, these are the reasons why these things are important, because it puts a false idea in the minds of black people when you're teaching them history. Because I am a living example of how media influences can corrode the mind of black children, especially when they do not have strong black people teaching them about their history. You grow up believing that America actually abolished slaves because you don't really find too many people telling you that that is not the truth. You don't find a lot of people. You go to history school, you go to history class in school, and they don't tell you that. They tell you that America abolished slavery, and that is patently absurd. That's why this is part of Black History Every Day. That's why there is a video being made. Now, let's see here. The domestic slave trade within the U.S. was unaffected by the 1808 law. Again, the domestic slave trade within the U.S. was unaffected. The United Kingdom, the major power involved in the Atlantic slave trade, had passed the comparable Abolition of Slave Trade Act on February 23rd, 1807. So, according to this, America did it first, and not the UK. I was wrong in that as well. I was the United Kingdom. I was wrong in that as well. So this is me conceding that point and going on record, changing that information that I falsely put out there, because I do not want to put false information out there. I have no problem being wrong. I have no problem being corrected if I'm wrong. Knowledge and information is not subjective as far as I'm concerned. And if there's better information out there, I go where the information leads me. And if the information leads me in the wrong direction, I got false information because I thought that the information was leading me into this direction. I have information now that contradicts that information, and now this is what I'm putting up. Because the whole point is to try to put out truth. I have nothing to hide. So let's see. Now, let's go back a few sentences. It reflected the force of the general trend towards abolishing the international slave trade, which Virginia, followed by all the other states, had prohibited or restricted since then. South Carolina, however, had reopened its trade. Congress first regulated against the trade in the Slave Trade Act of 1794. The 1794 Act made all importation from abroad a crime. So they had to go through this twice because they passed the law and basically white people pretty much said, F that, we're going to do what the hell we want to do. And they weren't being punished for it either. Mind you, again, we have to keep these things, we have to keep these things honest. We have to, because if we do not dissect this information, we will constantly be misled. So again, I stress, America has not ever abolished slavery. And as far as I can tell, Great Britain or the United Kingdom have not abolished slavery. They made slavery illegal, you know what I'm saying? like the 13th Amendment, for instance, made slavery illegal unless it's for conviction of a crime. Now let's look at a little bit of this background. The laws discussed here affected only the import or export of slaves. It did not affect the internal trade inside states between states. Article 1, Section 9 of the United States Constitution protected the international slave trade for 20 years from federal prohibition. By 1800, all states prohibited the international trade, but South Carolina reversed itself and permitted it. So I kind of, like I said, I'm trying to keep up with what I'm looking at on the screen because the audio was not recorded properly. So what I did was I went back up to the UK's Abolition of the Slave Trade Act and read that. Officially, an act for the abolition of the slave trade was an act of the Parliament of the United Kingdom prohibiting the slave trade in the British Empire. Although it did not abolish the practice of slavery, it did encourage British action to press other nation states to abolish the trading of slaves. Again, they did not abolish slavery. They just abolished the importing and exporting of slavery. These things matter. This information is important. This information is very important. So now I switch over to the word abolitionist. A person who favors the abolition or practice of a practice or institution. And then I go over, some synonyms of the word abolition. Scraping, ending, stopping, doing away with, termination, eradication, elimination, extermination, destruction, annihilation, obliteration, quashing. I can't hardly see that word because it's not magnified enough. Extirpation, annulment, cancellation, invalidation, nullification, dissolution, revocation, repeal, rescindment, overturning, discontinuation, removal. You guys get the picture, right? These are all synonyms of the word abolition. Termination, annihilation, destruction. When were these laws ever eliminated, obliterated, revoked? Revocation is revoked. Repealed. When were the laws on slavery, making slavery legal, ever abolished, right? When were they ever ended? When did they ever get the axe? You understand? When did they ever scrub this stuff off the books? They never took these laws off the books. What they did was amended the laws in certain ways, and amending the law as opposed to abolishing it and taking it out, taking the language out and replacing it with language that actually upholds the sentiment that you're trying to bring forth. They did not do that. They just amended these things. Sorry about that, guys. People in California are jackasses. You don't need to hit the alarm button 4 times to know that your alarm is on. So again, pardon me for the background and disturbances. But if you don't actually take the wording out, rephrase these words, you create loopholes by amending the law or amending that particular amendment in the Constitution. You amend it, but then you don't actually change it. You create more loopholes. Again, the 13th Amendment is the proof that by amending the laws that made slavery legal, you left loopholes to continue on with the act of enslaving people. The 13th Amendment says that slavery is illegal unless it is for conviction of a crime. You understand? So your punishment for being convicted of a crime is that you are introduced into slavery. Or at least you can be, right? So what happens in America is they create the prison industrial complex and they make everything black people do illegal. That's what the Jim Crow laws are for. Everything you could possibly think of was illegal for black people. Being in certain parts of the town at nighttime, walking on grass, not giving way to white people on a sidewalk. Just about anything a black person could do was illegal. Why? So they could fill up the prisons, create false narratives, create these negative stereotypes, and then place those stereotypes on us, make us live up to those stereotypes, and then say, see, this is what these people were all the time. So let's see. I read that part already. Let's see. The migration or importation of such persons as any of the state now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by Congress. And this is Article 5. Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution describes the process whereby the Constitution, the nation's frame of government, may be altered. Under Article 5, the process to alter the Constitution consists of proposing an amendment or amendments to subsequent ratification. So they left themselves an out. You understand what these were very brilliant people, the founding fathers. They were very smart men, and they left themselves a way out. You understand? Because at any point when they felt like what they were doing wasn't going to benefit them, they can go back into the Constitution at any point and change it. That's what Article 5 is. Their way out of making certain mistakes. You know what I'm saying? Listen, I'm not a fan of white supremacy. However, I think that you have to recognize the brilliance of your enemy. If you don't recognize what they do well, you'll never see the shit coming. You'll never see it coming. If you do not recognize what your enemies do and give them credit for the things that they do well, you will always be unprepared for it. You understand? I like what Neely Fuller says. If you do not have a full understanding of white supremacy is, everything you think you know will only confuse you. Now, I know I didn't quote him exactly. That was more of a paraphrase version, but you guys get the gist, right? So, back on to the 1808 Slave Abolition Act. Now, see, in the 18th century, Great Britain had become Europe's largest slave trader. During the American Revolution, 1775 to 1783, against Great Britain, all the states banned the Atlantic slave trade. You see, all these things are being put into perspective. They banned the Atlantic slave trade because they were at war. Because remember, 1774 or 94 is when this, March 22nd, 1794, Congress passed the Slave Trade Act of 1794, which prohibited making, loading, outfitting, equipping, or dispatching of any ship to be used in the trade of slaves, essentially limiting the trade to foreign ships. Do you guys understand? Them abolishing the slave trade act. Remember, think about this. We are putting this in perspective for you. See, they did not abolish slavery. And whatever they did do, they didn't do it for the benefit of black people. Like Thomas Jefferson was one of the people who put this up. You understand? Thomas Jefferson enjoyed the fact that he owned slaves. You understand? They did this because they were at war with each other. The United States banned trading slaves or importing and exporting slaves so that they can hurt or cripple what Great Britain was doing. And Great Britain then turned around and did the same thing as an act of defiance against the United States, against America. This was an infight between two slave-owning colonizers, two slave-owning colonizing nations. The abolition of the importing and exporting of slavery had nothing to do with the black people that they were enslaving. It had everything to do with them not wanting the other to continue to make massive amounts of money off of the importing and exporting of slaves from each other. They were trying to cripple each other's economy. The Slave Trade Act 1807, officially an act of the abolition of the slave trade, was an act of the Parliament of the United Kingdom prohibiting the slave trade in the British Empire. Although it did not abolish the practice of slavery, it did encourage British action to press other nations, states to abolish their slave trade. See? Again, we have to look at the language. And now I go over to the History Channel. Let's see. The U.S. Congress passes an act to prohibit the importation of slaves, into any port or place within the jurisdiction of the United States from any foreign kingdom, place, or country. The first shipload of African captives to North America arrived at Jamestown, Virginia in August 1619, but for the most of the 17th century, European indentured servants were far more numerous in the North American British colonies than were African slaves. Of course, we know that because the first slaves didn't reach the shores of the United States until 1619. That's when they shipped us up from the Caribbean. Because, see, again, they were breaking us for the past 200 years. 100 and some odd years, 200 years down in the Caribbean. When the ancestors of those people first taken from Africa were ripe to be enslaved, then they brought them up to Virginia. You know? Remember, white people were not slaves. They were indentured servants, and they were treated way better than the slaves were. The indentured servants only had to serve 7 years as indentured servants to pay off debt. They received land and public assistance afterwards. Do you understand that? So every advantage that white people have gotten, most of them squandered or blew that shit. Right? Now, let's see. And also another thing. See, the indentured servants, that was just their filler until they got the Africans to the point in which they could be controlled the way that we were controlled for the duration of slavery and up until this point. Because the white indentured servants just weren't working out. Black people worked longer, harder. We were stronger. We were better workers. We just did the jobs better. You understand that? We did the job, which is why they wanted to enslave us in the first place. Because we're the strongest group of people on the face of the planet. We're some of the hardest working people that exist. Nobody else, no other group of people could have survived that much torment for as long as we have. They could not have. Let's see. After the war, as slave labor was not a crucial element of the northern economy, most northern states passed legislation to abolish slavery. However, in the South, the invention of the cotton gin in 1793 made cotton a major industry and sharply increased the need for slave labor. Now, see, again, most northern states passed legislation to abolish slavery. Most northern states. That's not true. In the northern states that were trying to abolish slavery, those were states where most likely there were mostly Quakers that lived in those states. Because remember, the Quakers were some of the first abolitionists, non-black abolitionists in this country. The Quakers. You understand that? There were slaves in the North. You understand? There were slaves in the North. And again, abolishing the slave trade was a direct, again, this is more infighting with white supremacy. They weren't trying to abolish slavery because they thought it would be good for black people. Again, they were trying to cripple the economy of the South. Understand that they were trying to cripple the South. Understand these things. It had nothing to do with us. It has everything to do with them trying to get an advantage over their own people. Understand these things. U.S. law abolishing transatlantic slave trade takes effect. Again, the language is out there. Stop believing that the slave trade was abolished by America, that slavery rather was abolished by America. Because think about it, 1808, and then some 50 some odd years later, we get the Emancipation Proclamation, which again did not free slaves because Abraham Lincoln did not have the authority to free slaves in the South. By that time, the South had seceded from the nation and from the Union and became their own independent nation states. Understand this. Understand these things. Abraham Lincoln was not the president of the Confederate States. He was the president of the Union States. Because at that time, when the country was split between the Union and the Confederacy, there was no United States. It only became the United States after they had reunited and reabsorbed the Southern Confederate States back into the Union. Understand that. The language and words mean something. The way they say these things means something. It's prestidigitation. They use certain language to make you believe something that isn't true. And if you just read a little bit, you will uncover some of these truths in how they say and use certain words and phrases. So back to the Emancipation Proclamation. Abraham Lincoln promised the enslaved Africans in the South their freedom if they would only come to the Union and join their army to fight against slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation didn't mean anything. The 13th Amendment that Abraham Lincoln put into effect after the Civil War had been fought and won. Let's see. Let me read this real quick. And I'm probably not going to. I was talking. So anyway. What that did, again, it made slavery illegal unless it was for the conviction of crimes. Now, okay, how many slaves were freed? Because what I just read there, that there weren't that many slaves in the country. That there weren't that many enslaved Africans in the country. The total population included 3,953,762 slaves. By the time the 1860 census returns were ready for tabulation, the nation was sinking into the American Civil War. Right? Total population of America at the time, 31,443,321. So that means that we were just 10% of the population at that point, and we were all slaves at that point. We're just above 10% of the population, maybe 12, 13, 14% of the population, and every single one of us was a slave. Right? Every single one of us was a slave. Come on, man. Let's see. That significant had limited the illegal slave trade did not continue, though smaller numbers than had been true of the legal trade. The law also did not stop the sale of those already held in slavery. For the next several decades, as many as 1 million enslaved African Americans were sold within the United States. Not until after the American Civil War would slavery and this internal slave trade be finally abolished. Again, let's look at the language. The Emancipation Proclamation does not abolish slavery. See, in the American Constitution, they are very careful with the words that they choose to use. If they wanted slavery to be abolished, then the 13th Amendment would have read maybe as such, would have included the word, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall be permitted within the United States. This act is abolishing the act of enslaving people, trading in slavery, and indentured servitude. The words abolish, abolishment, abolitionist, they do not appear in the Constitution of the United States. Those words, synonyms of those words, don't appear in the Constitution or the Bill of Rights at any point. Synonyms, words that mean the same thing as abolish, like we just went over not too long ago, do not appear in the Constitution. So that means that the United States never abolished slavery. They just made slavery illegal so far as on a civil level, basically. So your neighbor can't entrap you and then put you into slavery. That's illegal. He'll go to prison for that. But if you break laws, the government has the right to force you into slavery. Because once you have committed a law and you're on trial for that law, you walk into a courtroom, all your rights are suspended. Just like slaves. Just like the enslaved people, the enslaved Africans, they didn't have rights. Understand these things. Abolitionist, a person who favors the abolition of a practice or institution, especially capital punishment or formerly slavery, the abolitionist movement. Right? A person who favors the abolition. Remember, synonyms for abolition: annihilation, junking, scrubbing, getting rid of, period. America never did that. So again, January the 1st, 1808, the Abolition of the Slave Trade Act. These things are important. Now notice the abolition of the Slave Trade Act. They made sure they used the word abolition, abolishing the slave trade. Slave Trade Act. Pardon me for that. They made sure they used that language because that is the thought they were trying to convey. They abolish. You cannot do this anymore, ever. So let's go over the 13th Amendment real quick. To the United States, the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution abolished slavery and involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime. In Congress, it was passed by the Senate on April 2nd, 1864, and by the House on January 31st, 1865. Let's see. See, what does the 13th Amendment mean? See, this is Google giving what it means, right? Or what they're telling you it means: abolish slavery and involuntary servitude. Except. The word except is very important. It's very important because the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution abolishes slavery and involuntary servitude. Except pretty much means, now forget what we just said. Now listen to what I'm about to say now. Except, let's see. What did the 13th Amendment do? The 13th Amendment to the Constitution declared that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction. What is the loophole in the 13th Amendment? Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction. If you commit a crime, you can still be a slave in America. That's what that means. If you commit a crime, you can still be a slave. The except, that word except is big, because it doesn't say it. In 1865, is slavery still legal? Let's see, providing a legal basis for slavery to continue in the country. Basically, the 13th Amendment still provides a legal basis for slavery to continue in the country. In 1865, the United States passed the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which bans slavery and involuntary servitude except as a punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, providing a legal basis for slavery to continue in this country. Do you guys understand that? Do you understand what this means? This information is there for everybody to see. It's there for everybody to bear witness to. Understand, the words mean everything. How the words are used mean everything. See, what people do is they quote mine. They find the things that correspond with the thought that they're trying to convey, and then they present that version of the story to you. Now, if you just read a few sentences before or after whatever they're quote mining, you will get the true intent of what is actually being conveyed via the message that they're trying to tell you. So a white history teacher will always sell you the whole idea that slavery was abolished. Let's see, due to the Union measures such as the Confiscation Acts and Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, the war effectively ended slavery. But it didn't, because right after that, see, because I go right back to that. Let's see. Effectively ended slavery even before ratification of the 13th Amendment in December of 1865, formally ended the legal institution of slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation did not free anybody. It didn't free the enslaved Africans that were in this country. It did not. It just gave them the how do you say? It gave them the incentive they needed to leave the South for the North, thinking that there was going to be something better for them waiting in the North. It just gave them incentive. That's it. And that's all it was. It was demagoguery. It's kind of what Trump is doing now when he says to black people, I mean, the Democrats haven't done anything for you. Like, what if you got to lose by voting for me? That's kind of what Abraham Lincoln was saying. Like, look, I don't necessarily like black people, but I mean, what if you got to lose? Like, we don't want to enslave you. We don't want to make you property and garden tools. Like, what if you got to lose by coming up here with us? We may not treat you any differently, but at least you won't be shackled to, like, come on, man. That was a ploy to usher in capitalism. Anyway, let's move on. Now, this video is going to be close to 40 minutes long because I think it is important to try to unpack as much of this as possible and stop believing in the lies that America teaches us. You have to learn. You have to read these things and understand them for yourself. If you don't, and you allow somebody else, if you allow white people to dictate to you what black history is, then you will never understand what true black history is or what true history is. If you continue to allow them to tell you what history is and give you their, like the Harriet Tubman movie, for instance. Everything in that movie could have been true, but the fact that they created two characters who did not exist in Harriet Tubman's life to portray images of black people that were not true during that time, is them misleading you about what history was. The fact that we have women like Julia Roberts, a white woman, a bony-ass white woman who was offered to play the role of Harriet Tubman. When white people are trying to do stuff like that, they have no respect for the past. They have no respect for our history and what we contribute. And we see this throughout history. Everywhere we are and they go, they usurp the information and the knowledge, and then they whitewash it and twist it and turn it and mutate it to make it more, to make history serve their end goal. They bend it to the image they want to convey, and then that's what they teach you. Everything that they do is based on a lie. White supremacy is based on lies, deceit, misdirection, and prestidigitation. Understand that. That's why there's so many lies to actually be uncovered, because they have to continue to tell lies in order to get you to think that it's the truth. And this is what I truly feel. America learned a lot from Nazi Germany. America learned a lot. America picked up on what Nazi Germany was doing, and then they just started implementing the same tactics over here. They're going to always lie to us about history. They're always going to give us their version of what they want us to think history is. They're always going to downplay what we've contributed to this country and to the history of this country, and try to always big up themselves, which is why you never hear white people quoting black historians. They're always only ever quoting white historians. Even white people who claim to be non-biased, non-racist, liberal white people, blah, 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 they do the same thing. They do the same thing because they're biased in their information. If they were truly not biased, they would look at history from both perspectives and not just the white one. I mean, I've seen white people who admit that white people lie about history and still only quote white historians and think that white knowledge is all there is. It's unfortunately sad, but it's the truth. Unfucking fortunately. So, again, pardon me for... I'm very close to this information. I feel very passionate about it. So pardon my language and pardon me using certain curse words. I get that way when I'm very passionate about a subject. So pardon me. Now here, again, is me showing examples of the 13th Amendment. Again, we have to understand that the 13th Amendment did not abolish slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation did not abolish slavery. The Abolition of the Slave Trade Act of 1808 did not abolish slavery. The British version of that act a few years later did not abolish slavery. All they did was change the nature of the slave trade. They didn't abolish a thing. They just changed the nature of it. And that is important to us because white people, white supremacy only see us as one thing. A tool to be used to further their own goals. And they will constantly have us infighting and clawing each other's eyes out and going for the jugular of each other, fighting over semantics, when all we have to do is sit back and listen to what they're telling us. We don't need to argue over what white people and white supremacy is telling us. We can look at it and see what it is actually doing to us and in our communities. We have to smarten up and we have to stop buying into the garbage. We have to, or we're done.